Hey everyone, welcome to LSAT Wizard's free question type explanations. This is going to be a video for sufficient assumption questions. Now, these videos are an extension of our logical reasoning and reading comprehension COVID relief course. We have our free content and free core lessons that we've already recorded. So go check those out if you haven't already, as some of the content that we're going to be talking about today in this lesson, in this video, is going to be coming from there. Now, before we get into it, a couple things. First, I want to thank Ave Maria School of Law, our sponsor. None of this would be happening if it wasn't for them. Second, the COVID relief aspect of this course is that we have a GoFundMe going directly to Feeding America's COVID Relief Fund. We have already raised over $10,000, which is truly amazing. So thank you everybody who has already given. I also want to thank everybody in advance who will. And for those that haven't yet, if you found these videos at all helpful, I kindly ask you to find that GoFundMe and give any amount is definitely appreciated. So thank you, everybody. Now, with that being said, we are going to be doing this video on sufficient assumptions. Sufficient assumptions we covered in lesson 2 of the core content. This outline and all of the core content videos you can find on my YouTube channel on lsatwizard.com if you go to our free stuff, free content portion of the page. Now, we did cover sufficient assumptions as a concept. So I always talk about things in terms of concepts and question types. And sufficient assumptions are a concept, but this lesson is going to be the question type. So I'm going to be getting into it kind of quickly, but if you're looking for more on sufficient assumptions, go check out our lessons, especially lesson 2, where we went into the concept of sufficient assumptions. Now, what that concept of a sufficient assumption is something that wasn't stated, but if it was added to an argument, it would make the argument 100%. So taking that and interpreting it, we are going to be presented with an argument, which means that there's going to be evidence and a conclusion. And the evidence is going to fall short of proving that conclusion. It's going to get maybe 80% there, 90% there, whatever the number is, it's irrelevant. The idea is it's not hitting 100%. What you are looking for and what you are being tasked with by the question is finding an answer choice that would make the argument perfect. It would make the argument 100% proven. Now, when I say that, I just want to differentiate. It doesn't have to just make it a little better. It can't just support the argument. That would be a strengthening question, which is covered separately. Sufficient assumptions are questions that will make the argument 100% true. Now, how do we know we have a sufficient assumption question? By question stem, it's going to tell you that you need an answer choice that will make the argument true. Specifically, we'll see the word assumes in the answer and the question stem typically, and it's going to say that assumption, which the following if assumes, so the answer is going to be an assumption that if you do assume it, if true, it would allow the conclusion to follow logically. And that language follow logically is very different than just supporting the argument. Follow logically means that it's proven. The conclusion, another one, the conclusion would be properly drawn. So they're saying the conclusion would be 100% properly drawn means that 100% valid. And they're saying if which of the following assumptions was true. So again, answers are assumptions that if we accept it would lead to the conclusion then being 100%. It falls in the family of what I call invalid questions, which just tells you that when you go to the stimulus, you have an invalid argument. Okay. When we break down questions, I do like to always break it down in terms of what we call the pre-answer and the test. For those unfamiliar with my terminology, pre-answering is what we think about while we're reading the stimulus. It's not a prediction. Okay. I know a lot of places try to do predictions. It's a little different. Okay. It's going to overlap, but the idea is sometimes we're not necessarily predicting, but we still want to gather our thoughts and think about things while we're reading the stimulus. So before you even look at an answer choice, that's what we call pre-answering. The testing is going to be what we do with our answer choice. How do we mentally break down that answer choice and make sure we understand what's correct or not? Now, the pre-answer for a sufficient assumption, the idea, the outline here has this like good news, bad news. The good news is that it's easier to pre-answer. The bad news is going to be something about the testing, specifically in reference to necessary assumptions, which we had more formal testing for. Now, what the pre-answer for sufficient assumption is, why it's good news. Over 80% are going to rely on the concept we refer to as jumps. They're going to be talking about one thing over here. All of a sudden, they're going to start talking about something else over there, even though the author wants you to think that they're talking about the same thing. So there's going to be this insinuation of two separate ideas from phrases. That's always the key. It's ideas from different phrases that the author wants you to think are actually overlapping. That is what we refer to as a jump. Again, lesson 2 went into that heavy of our core lessons. Now, in terms of sufficient assumptions, over 80% will rely on the mistake of a jump. If you see some other mistake, again, I said it's 80%, so 1 in 5 that you come across is going to be something different. You're trying to figure out what that hole is in the argument, what is missing there, okay? And we do our best with that. Remember, you're never going to be able to pre-answer 100% of the time. Everybody's going to miss a pre-answer at some point in time. Now, when we do go to the test, what we're going to think about is we can't do the negation test. So I like to clarify the negation test is that necessary assumption test. Okay, it's that idea of negating an answer statement by weekends. I'm not going to go into that here because that actually relates to necessary assumptions. Sufficient assumptions, what we have to do instead. We have to think about how this would bridge a gap or fill a hole. It's got to do one of the two. Either the answer is tying together two ideas, and those two ideas are things that were stated in the stimulus, and so it's going to highlight a jump, or it's going to fill in some hole that when added to an argument would again make all the pieces come together validly. So this really does rely on your ability to understand what valid reasoning is, which if you're having trouble with that, go back to lesson 1 because we really get into what those fundamentals of valid reasoning are. Now, with this, we're going to put it into action with the June 2007 examples. If you haven't already done these, go look them up, okay? June 2007, we have a few examples here. You can Google June 2007 LSAT. LSAT has it on their website as a free PDF. You can go do these questions, pause the video right now, go do them, then come back because I'm going to just be getting right into the explanations. So with that being said, we're going to go to the first one, the June 2007 section 2, question 6. So if we look at the question stem, the argument's conclusion follows logically if which of the following is assumed. It's exactly one of the ones I had written out earlier. The answer they're telling you is an assumption that will, if assumed, will be something that allows the conclusion to follow logically, making it 100%. Our mind is on guard for language. Now, the way that we've discussed catching language is by highlighting the conclusion, which in this case, Murray cannot be accepted for the position of executive administrator. And we break it into parts. We think about what are the parts. Subject matter characteristic is the easiest breakdown. But at the end of the day, I never care if you're perfect with it, as long as you're practicing this ability of mentally breaking a conclusion into two parts. Okay. Sometimes there's obviously more parts too, and you have to be ready for that. Murray is our subject matter. The characteristic of what they're saying in the conclusion is that he cannot be accepted for the position of executive administrator. Now, the way we know that's the conclusion, the word thus. They give you a first line. They say further. Further means more evidence. So here's this first piece of evidence that of what's necessary for the executive board. Further, no one with a felony can be appointed to the board. Thus, so they're saying based on those two ideas, here's our conclusion. Now, Murray, it starts off, but then it goes into this idea of an accountant with both a bachelor's and master's. This is what we call subphrasing, when there's like an idea between two commas. It's almost like there's a parentheses. It's almost like parenthetical, like there's parentheses around those ideas. You want to learn to read around those ideas and then mentally realize that subphrasing typically will be just adding evidence or some sort of definition or description of what they're kind of pausing at. So Murray, here's some information about him, but really the conclusion is that he cannot be accepted for the position of executive administrator. Now, the word since is synonymous with the word because. Structurally, we have to be able to separate the evidence versus the conclusion, and since and because do just that. Since and because always separate evidence from conclusion. It's since I have my evidence, comma, I have my conclusion, or it's going to be I have my conclusion, comma, since I have my evidence. That second one is what we have here. So the pink and yellow is our conclusion, and I've already broken it into two parts. Subject matter of Murray, characteristic of cannot be accepted for the position of the executive board administrator. Now, how do we catch a language jump? We ask ourselves, do we have evidence of pink? Yes or no? It's just a yes or no question. And the answer is yes. This underline is our evidence about Murray. And this last part, he has a felony. That is also evidence about Murray. So we do have, the answer is just yes. Well, I'm not even going to go to what that evidence is just yet. I'm just going to say in my head, oh yeah, Murray, we have evidence about. Do we have evidence about what like some sort of characteristic that cannot be accepted for the position of executive administrator? And what we have to recognize on this test is when new language comes up, especially when new language in the conclusion comes up. Executive administrator, I'm highlighting the wrong part. Executive administrator, where did that come from? Where did that come from? They never talked about executive administrator anywhere. What they want is for us to have thought executive board is the same thing as executive administrator. Now, in your mind, you might be like, but isn't the executive administrator on the executive board? They didn't say that. That's not going to fall within LSAT common sense acceptance. We do have that standard that I talked about a lot in the course of this LSAT common sense standard that sometimes we will have to make jumps that are within common sense as far as LSAC is concerned. But this is not one of them. Saying that an executive administrator and CAP, some sort of specific position, is definitively on the executive board. An executive assistant isn't on the executive board. An executive administrator isn't necessarily on the board. It's an executive position, but it's not necessarily on the board. And since you highlight that, once you recognize that, now you've caught your mistake. These oranges are what they want you to do, okay, to catch. And we need an answer that connects that. If you don't have answers, in an answer, if you don't have an answer that connects something from the evidence to executive administrator, you have a problem. So I'm just going to highlight, I'm going to color code a little differently here. So getting rid of everything here, our jump, so that we have two different colors, is from pink to orange, right? That what's true of pink is true of orange, or vice versa, that what's true of orange is true of pink, that the standards are the same. That's what they're insinuating, that the standards are the same. We know if we did follow the evidence, Murray has a felony, which means he cannot be appointed to the board. And then they're saying, thus, he cannot be appointed to the executive administrator. So the idea is if you are not allowed on the board, then you're not allowed on the administrator. And that's where jumps. We also do want to get that direction. So I just kind of went through it there. Again, our evidence, since Murray, if we did follow that chain, since Murray does have a felony and no one with a felony can be appointed, we can tie Murray, our subject matter, to definitively not being pink. And so if you're not allowed on pink, then you're not allowed on orange, since the conclusion really was that you cannot be accepted for executive administrator. So not pink, not executive board means not executive administrator. That's our jump. Now, at the end of the day, what I was trying to get at earlier is that if you have any evidence that connects to executive administrator, that we can, any evidence about Murray that ties to we cannot be appointed to executive administrator, that would be acceptable. Okay, we will see that in other questions where they tie other pieces of information, not the ones you're expecting. But realize that the correct answer in a sufficient assumption question has to have information that is on target with that new language of our conclusion. So not every stimulus in a sufficient assumption will have new language, but when they do have new language, your answer has to be on point with that new language. Okay, so when we specifically are looking for the right answer here, what they're saying here, only candidates eligible for the appointment to the executive board can be accepted for the position of executive administrator. That is a what we call perfect assumption. It's both sufficient and necessary. We didn't care whether it's necessary, but when you see a jump and you pre-answer it, how I said, if it's not on the executive board, then it's not executive administrator. This is exactly that same logic. Okay, B is exactly that. And then you could jump all over it, pick it, move fast, and be confident and move on. Now, if you were getting caught up in the other answers, let's take a look. So anyone with a master's and without a felony is eligible for the executive board. Two things. First, our conclusion was that you cannot be accepted. Any standard for when you can be accepted would already be inverse logic. It's that reverse logic that doesn't actually have any logical play on it. Telling me standards for when you would be eligible would be irrelevant for when you're not eligible. Second, this doesn't bring up executive administrator. It's relying on the same language jump that it's about the executive board. Two reasons why A is wrong. C, an undergraduate degree is not necessary for acceptance. So what they're saying in C is that an undergraduate degree is not necessary. Again, this would not create a standard for telling us that that you cannot be on the executive administrator. It's telling you about a factor that's not relevant, meaning it's not necessary, meaning it could happen, it couldn't happen. We don't know. So it would allow possibly, it doesn't say for sure this is executive administrator, but it also doesn't tell us for sure it's not. And since our conclusion is that definitively we cannot be accepted for the executive administrator position, we needed an answer that creates that standard. D, if Murray did not have a felony conviction, he would be accepted for position. This is exactly that inverse language I was describing in answer choice A. They're creating a standard for when he definitively would. If A, then B is very different than if not A, then not B. If you don't understand that, you got to go back to the core concepts. Specifically, lesson 1, we talk about it. I talk about it, really reference it in all lessons. Lesson 1, we went over it. 4, we'll be talking about conditionality more. So this is where you really have to make sure you understand conditionality and just the basic patterns of A, B is not the same of not A, not B. And that's what D is trying. E, the felony charge on which Murray was convicted is relevant to the duties. This is, again, not creating a standard for whether you are or are not allowed to be the executive administrator. We needed something that says definitively not. This is just saying that it's relevant to the duties of. It wouldn't create a standard for whether you could be accepted or not. So that's why E is out. All right, question 13. The conclusion of the argument follows logically if which of the following is assumed. Again, if we assume the answer, then the conclusion follows logically. That creates a sufficient assumption question. Now, this one is definitely out of, we actually coincidentally had 5 questions. And if memory serves, I actually looked over these the other day before jumping back into this video. So I didn't prepare it today. I had kind of did this the other day. But by memory, if I'm correct here, this one is the only one out of 5 that's not based on language. This is that example I said earlier. Over 80%, it's about 80, a little over, will be related to jumps. The other ones will. This one is not. Now, if we were kind of doing the language just to see it in action, what happens if we tried looking for language in a question where it's not? We have to first start by following finding the conclusion. Now, it's that M contains twice as many cans as L. If we broke that into parts, okay, they are comparing M and L. Those are our subject matters. And the characteristic is that it contains twice as many cans. So we'd have to ask ourselves, do we have evidence about M? Do we have evidence about L? And do we have evidence that allows us to compare them around how many cans they have? So we do have evidence of M and we do have evidence of L. So the pink subject matters are backed up. The question is, do we have evidence about containing twice as many cans? Where would that language come from? And they kind of do, because they say that here, all the amount, so basically the amount of material other than aluminum in a can is negligible. So right there, what they're telling us about the cans, and this is where, by the way, if we look for the language quickly and the answer is yes and yes, that's when you have to start interpreting that language. What are they actually saying? Follow the chain, follow the logic, figure out what's going on of why some reason this evidence, the rest of this argument, besides this last part that I have highlighted here, what is going on? So I'll now underline it. This is our conclusion. Everything that's not underlined is evidence. We have to ask ourselves, why are they falling short? Where are they getting close but yet falling short to proving the underline? So I'm following that language. What I know about a can is basically that it's all aluminum. They're saying anything besides aluminum is negligible. So cans are purely aluminum. And then they start comparing L and M's aluminum. What they tell us is that all of L's aluminum, so this group L, which is actually the smaller group that they're saying, right? So M is twice as many cans as L. And the reason they're saying that is because we used 100% of L. Okay, L was recycled from, sorry, I'm actually in the wrong line here. I'm going off memory again. All of the cans in L were recycled into cans of M. So we used L to make M. L was our building material to make M. And in using the building material, we used all of L. There wasn't any leftover L. So L as a group, we used all of it to build M. And once we built M, M's aluminum is 50% L. So we had to use not just L. So we used 100% of L as building material, but they're basically saying, but there was other building material as well. The other building material for M, we don't know where it came from, but we know that it exists because M by the end is only 50% L. So the other 50% of M is not coming from L. So the idea is if you're using 100% of L to build M, and then M, that build is 50%, why would M then, if M has 50% of other things, the twice as many cans comes from the fact that it was 50-50, right? So if you just had, let's just say, for example, 10 cans are owned, let me say by ownership as opposed to building, and that's going to get into the heart of this. If we are owning, if person L owned 10 cans and he gives all 10 cans to M, person M. So L owns 10 cans and he gives all 10 of his to M. And now we know after L gave all 10 cans to M, M has a bunch of cans. And what they say is 50% of M's cans came from L. Well, if 10 cans from L make up 50% of M, we have to be able to do that little math that M then has double that number of 20 cans. 10 came from L, 10 came from not L. And that's what the math of the twice as many. So you might be saying, so then why is this invalid? They are saying it's twice as many. I honestly didn't even pre-answer this. This is one of those like, I'm really not sure. But when I read this answer, all of the aluminum can in an aluminum can is recovered when the can is recycled. So this is where they're getting into actually the difference between my example of ownership versus building. What they're saying is, even when I did the ownership, it worked because if I give you 10 cans, then you have 10 cans. But what they're saying is we used L's 10 cans to build new cans for M. Okay. But what if we needed 10 cans worth of material to build just 5 cans for M? The way that we broke down L's material and then reformed the cans, what if we didn't form 10 cans? We only formed 5 cans. What if we formed 1 can? Now, all of a sudden, M may not have twice as many cans because the cans it got from L isn't 10. We may have used 10 cans for L, but in breaking down that material and then making new cans, it may not have to have been 10 new cans. And so what C is saying is that would be true. C is saying is that it would be 10 for 10. That if you use 10 cans, okay, and I'm using this arbitrary number, obviously 10 is not a number they're saying there. I'm just making it up. It's about material too. It's not just about number of cans, it's about material. So the idea is that if we used all of the aluminum in L and it's recovered, that would mean that if you break down 10 cans for L and build new cans, you're going to build 10 new cans, which then makes it more like that ownership idea that I'd said earlier. And that's where C proves this to be correct. Okay. The rest of the answers don't really hit on that issue. If I was to go into them a little more specifically, the aluminum in the cans of M cannot be recycled further. This is telling you what happens once they already belong to M. We needed something in the conversion from L to M. The question is, did L, if we do 10 cans from L to M, and M has now 50% from L, why would it not just be double then the number? And A doesn't hit on that issue at all. So recycled aluminum is of poorer quality than unrecyclable. This is about how the quality, focus on the characteristic of each answer. So when I read answers, I'm thinking about what is the subject matter, what are the characteristics? We do the same language breakdown. Language, degree, conditionality is always what we do with basically every phrase we read. With these answers, I'm thinking about how would it bridge? This is that test I was talking about earlier. So I didn't have a pre-answer, so I gotta be thinking about how would this bridge or fill a hole, okay? And what this would be doing is kind of bridging that recycling of L into the math that proved this. Now, if this one, by the way, just let me say, as I said, this one's not the typical, it wasn't part of our 80%, okay? And even in the 20% that aren't jumps, a lot of those will fit more cookie cutter standard issues. This one is so not cookie cutter. So don't stress too much about this one if this was confusing, but I'm doing my best to try and break these answers down for you. So recycled aluminum is of poorer quality. When you focus on this characteristic of poor quality, that's irrelevant to this question in this argument of building down recycling material and building new cans, and what quality it was, it doesn't number. Okay, so D, none of the soft drink cans in L had been made from recycling. This is like, where did L get it from? We don't care where L got it from. The question was, in giving it from L to M, what was going on? And so focusing on what M did with it after and is A, and D is where did L get it from? Irrelevant to the argument. Aluminum soft drink cans are more easily recycled than our soft drink cans made from other materials. This is creating a comparison of aluminum versus others. This is a degree, you have to notice the degree of comparison, relativity. Aluminum versus other materials is not relevant because we never cared about other materials in this argument. C is just telling us about aluminum. Aluminum has this characteristic at the absolute level. It's a non-comparative, okay? And it's strong enough to tell you for sure that you are going from this 100% to the next one. And that's where C ends up being the correct answer. Moving on. Which of the following is an assumption that would allow the conclusion above to be properly drawn? So they're telling you the assumption, which is the answer choices, if assumed, which means unstated evidence that we'd be adding. So if we do assume it, if we do accept it, it would make the conclusion properly drawn. So again, I'm going to go to the conclusion. I'm on guard for language jumps. So when we go to the conclusion, it is every year it will be necessary for all high-risk individuals to receive a vaccine for a different strain of a virus. Now, I'm going to show you the technical way to break this down in terms of subject matter characteristic, but remember what I've said a bunch. It doesn't matter if you're not perfect at this. Just do your best and you'll get better over time naturally. And even when you're not perfect, you can still start to highlight these jump issues. So if we were to break it down, I think about the subject matter. The subject matter is like a grammar thing. Like who or what are we talking about here? And what they're talking about is all high risk individuals. Okay, that is what we're saying. That's who we're talking about, all high risk individuals. And what we're saying about the yellow, it's like an extended characteristic. We call that the extended parts. So the extended characteristic is that every year it's going to be necessary for them to receive a different strain of the vaccine, a vaccine. They're going to receive a vaccine for a different strain of the virus. All right, so every year it will be necessary for them to receive a vaccine for a different strain of the virus. Now, what evidence do we have about all high-risk individuals? Okay, it's just a yes or no. Do we have evidence about all high-risk individuals? Yes, all high-risk individuals is what we were talking about of this goal of this vaccination. And what happens is this is a great example of where extended parts, we have to be really clear of each portion of those extended parts. If you were watching lesson 1, we did the grad students with engineering degrees who take night classes work extra hard on any assignment, any in-class assignment given to them on a Friday before a holiday weekend. Following that language and not losing track of any portion of that is the key to this question right here. So every year it's necessary for them to receive a vaccine for a different strain of the virus. Where do we get language? Do we have language about every year what's necessary? Okay, well, the goal was for annual vaccination. So I'm okay with this. Like, okay, yeah, for these high risk to receive a vaccine for different strain. Now, every year getting one for a different strain. Why would we need a different strain? Where did different strain come from? They never talked about different strains being specifically what we need. Instead, what they said is every year, each year's vaccine, is what it says, will protect only against the strain most likely to be prevalent that year. So my 2 oranges are not on target, even though the author wants you to think. The reason they're saying a different strain of the virus is because it's only going to do the virus deemed most likely to be prevalent. Who says that the one most likely to be prevalent is different? Connecting these 2 oranges is the key. Remember, jumps do have a direction. So if I'm like erasing everything, now that I caught the jumps, everything of just these 2 oranges here, let's recolor code. So we have pink and we have orange. They are insinuating that the pink is going to be orange each year. So that the virus deemed most likely to be prevalent is different strain each year. We need an answer that ties that, and D is perfect. D does exactly that. Each year, the strain of the virus deemed most likely to be prevalent will be one that had not been deemed most prevalent the year before. So basically, it's different. When it's not previously been deemed, that is the language of different. Okay, so that's the idea of D. Now, again, when you have this type of jump, your answer needs to prove at least something about why a different strain. If it doesn't give me information tying something about this vaccine needing to be a different strain each year, then it's not right. Okay, because we needed the answer to prove it 100% correct. So even if it fixes partially or fixes something, if it doesn't fix that issue, then it's still going to fall short of 100%. So it wouldn't be sufficient as an assumption. So the number of individuals in the high risk group so if we were to accept that it will not significantly change of what? The number of individuals in the high risk group, did we care how many people were in that was our subject matter, all high risk individuals. How many were in that is not relevant to this argument. B, the likelihood that a serious influenza epidemic will occur varies. So the likelihood of influenza epidemic varying year to year is irrelevant because this whole thing came from a goal that will be an annual vaccination. This might be something, if anything, that would like maybe weaken, if anything, the government policy. Like, why are we doing this government policy if it's going to vary year to year? Now, obviously, in today's world, we better understand maybe we should be doing things as proactive regardless of the likelihood. But in this particular argument, there's no way that this would strengthen or even fix, let alone even strengthen anything in this argument. So B is incorrect. No vaccine for the influenza virus protects against more than one. this is something that's would maybe strengthen this argument, but I'm saying maybe because I think it's even just reinforcing evidence we already know, which we've talked about a bunch in lesson 3. Even we'll see it more of how the strengthening or attacking evidence is one of our big traps. Okay, we cannot just strengthen or attack evidence. Evidence is already established. We know that this vaccine will protect only against the strain deemed most likely. So saying that it only protects against one, nothing protects against more than one, I think is just reinforcing the pink, which means it doesn't do anything. Even if this was a strengthen, it wouldn't actually strengthen. But it definitely doesn't fix that we need the different. It still would leave open that hole in where they're getting different each year. Okay, because what if it's the same exact version each year? That's kind of the thought here. Each year's vaccine will have fewer side effects than the vaccine. This is focused on side effects. As soon as we talk about side effects, I mean, that is irrelevant to what would be needed for vaccination. Okay, having side effects, fewer side effects, I guess maybe would again, strengthen, if anything. I'm trying to think of why somebody would pick this. I try to not just brush off answers. I'm trying to think of why somebody might pick this. And all I'm seeing is that it might strengthen that we should do the government policy, but whether we should or should not do it is irrelevant. And we really just need to prove that we're accepting that the policy is in place. Policy is in place. Okay. But it's conditioned of, if we do this policy, right, what's happening? Wait, we have this policy. So what's going to happen? And each year, in order to kind of meet that policy goal, we're going to need a different strain. The side effects is irrelevant to needing a different strain, a vaccine for a different strain. So that's why E would be incorrect. Moving forward, sufficient assumption, if assumed, follows logically. Again, same format as we've seen a bunch. Now, this one ends up being a language jump that gets a little more challenging. You're getting to later questions in the section. It gets a little more challenging. It is going to relate to language jump, but they have a little misdirection here. They love misdirection on this test. If we look at this conclusion, actions that would be reasonably expected to leave unchanged the aggregate well-being of the people are also right. So subject matter characteristic. The subject matter is an extended subject matter. Actions that would be reasonably expected to leave unchanged the aggregate well-being of the people affected by them. And then we're saying they have the characteristic of being right. Now, the question is, what is the pink? Are we talking about it at all? Is it on target with anything in the evidence? Do we have evidence about the right? Now, evidence about right, we're yeah, we have right here. This is the first thought. Okay, morally right. We have evidence that tells me it's right. In fact, conditionally, I like the structure here. An action's morally right if. So if we get this orange characteristic, then we know it's right. So if we can connect pink and orange, then we have a valid argument. Now, we know it's not going to be valid because it's a sufficient assumption question, but I'm thinking at first, maybe this is my jump, right? An action is right if it would be reasonably expected to increase the aggregate well-being of the people. Now, what they're saying is it's going to leave it unchanged. Unchanged, in a way, is almost like opposite. It's not inclusive of increasing. This is saying it would reasonably be expected to increase the aggregate, where this one's saying it would be reasonably expected to leave unchanged. So unchanged is not the same as increased. Now, if you had in your head, okay, what if we have an answer choice that says, if we leave it unchanged, then that's as good as increasing? I would accept that answer. If you had an answer that said, if we have an action that would reasonably be expected to leave unchanged the aggregate well-being of the people, then that would be equivalent to increasing the aggregate well-being of the people. I'm okay with that. That would prove this argument correct, because then it would trigger the orange and tell us morally right. So that is where we could look for that answer. Okay. But there is no answer that does that. They don't say if unchanged, then that's the same as increasing. Okay. That would be a potentially correct answer, but it's just not there. So where do they get the right answer from? And this is where the misdirection comes into play. Okay. What we want to recognize is the pink leaving unchanged will actually affect this condition here. In this second sentence, they're saying an action is wrong. So I'm going to highlight that they're saying wrong if and only if this orange. Now, the orange is about reducing. Now, earlier I was saying how unchanged is not the same as increasing. Similarly, unchanged is not the same as reducing. So if we find out that it was unchanged, we can validly say it did not reduce. Now, we can't say if it doesn't reduce, then it was unchanged, because if you don't reduce it, it could be unchanged or it could increase. But if you are unchanged, that would definitively be saying it's not increasing, and it would be definitively saying that it's not reducing. Now, in the first sentence, we were like, okay, yeah, if it doesn't trigger the increase, then like, why would it tell us that it's right? Even if you were doing inverse logic to say that not increasing would mean not right, that wouldn't prove that it is right. So which remember, inverse logic is invalid. So we wouldn't have been able to say it's not right from that. But even if you were thinking that, it wouldn't get you to right. Now, when we come back to the second one, we do want to realize that pink does trigger that we don't have orange. So what I'm saying is, if when you have pink, when you have an action reasonably expected to leave it unchanged, that would on target trigger that it's not reducing, the opposite of the orange. The question is, can we conditionally then, if we don't have orange, can we say anything about yellow? Now, if and only if is language we went over in lesson 1, creates what we call biconditionality, or sufficient and necessary, or just the double arrow if you want to think of it that way. Okay, so it's if yellow, then orange, and if orange, then yellow, and if not orange, then not yellow, and if not yellow, then not orange. All of those are valid when you have if and only if. So if and only if. The key is that you actually have the word if twice. That's how you know you have the double, because you have if going one way, only if being the opposite of that, the other direction. So that's a double arrow. So since we have the double arrow, if we don't have orange, since we just said earlier, pink would trigger that we do not have orange. And if you don't have orange, then you don't have yellow. Now, not yellow is that it's not wrong. They're concluding that it's right. We would be able to say, again, since pink triggers not orange, we could say pink is not morally wrong, but they're saying that it's right. So if we can get an answer that goes from if something is not morally wrong, then it's right, that would bridge it. Remember, there is an in-between. There's just like neutral, morally neutral. Me eating a sandwich for lunch, that's not morally right. It's not morally wrong. It's just what I did. So there is an in-between between right and wrong, okay? And the answer is going to bridge that there really isn't. If it's not morally wrong, then it's morally right. So if we accept C, C is a bridge from the opposite of yellow, that it's not morally wrong, to saying that the second yellow, the right, is what's happening. So it creates that perfect bridge we needed. Now, the idea of this conclusion, the missing quote unquote thing, was trying to say that it's right. We need something that would tell us it's right. We did have, as we said, one standard in the first sentence, so it could have been something about that, but it would need to trigger that condition for what's morally right. Or the answer has to be directly on point with right. So when we look at the other answers, only wrong actions would be reasonably expected. This is again about wrong actions. We're concluding about right. Just as what the highlight of the main problem was, that we know that not wrong is not on point with right. That's why A would also not be on point with our conclusion. We need an answer that's going to make the conclusion 100% proven. So we needed to prove that this would be right, that the pink is right. No action is both right and wrong. Again, this is only giving you a standard for when something would be not right or not wrong. Saying no action is both right or wrong doesn't tell you when something would be right. That wouldn't actually do what C does, which is saying some people, this is like, if you know my games course, this is like creating a hater. If you accidentally created a brother and said, oh, so if it's not wrong, then it's right, which is what the correct answer is, then you made that mistake of confusing haters and brother logic. Okay, this is a hater. It's saying it can't be both right and wrong, as opposed to saying if it's not one, then it is the other. So B, because it's a hater, doesn't allow us to ever prove something is right. That makes it wrong. D, there are actions that would be reasonably expected to leave unchanged the aggregate well-being of this. So what they're saying in D is that we will in fact have pink actions. That's what it's saying. We're looking for where it's what there are actions that would reasonably be expected to leave unchanged, and the aggregate well-being of the people affected by them. Basically what they're saying is we have examples. There's some examples of pink, but it doesn't tell us whether it's right or wrong. So that's why it would be incorrect. That's what we need. We needed it to prove that it's right. Okay, only right actions have good consequences. So this, if we think about the conditionality, The word only is a necessary indicator. It's a then. So it's actually if something's good, then, well, I'm sorry. So if something, only right actions have this. So, so first thing I'm actually going to do, I'm going to pause for a second. And notice I had to even pause because I was so focused on conditional. I even fell for the exact trap I always tell people to not do. Focus on language first. I'm going to eliminate E without even worrying about the conditionality, and then I'll explain the conditionality. Good consequences. How would that be relevant to our conclusion of good consequences? Or we don't know this, and even the whole argument. Nothing is about when actually have good consequences. This is about what we would reasonably be expected. I guess you could argue that a reasonably expected to increase would, like, the actual increase in aggregate well-being would be a good consequence, but it's about reasonably expecting to. We don't know for sure that it does. So it doesn't actually create a standard of creating the good consequences, or we don't have, evidence that tells us good consequences or not. So this would be wrong for that language reason. Now, if we were to do a conditionality of this, what it's saying is only right actions have good consequences. So if something's not a right action, then it doesn't have good consequences. Or contrapositive, as I was saying, only is the necessary. So it'd be if a good consequence, then it's a right action. If something has good consequences, then it's a right action. That would just be another standard for when right. So I'm okay with that. But as I just said, then you'd have to look, okay, do we know for a fact that pink can be tied to good consequences? And if we can't tie pink to good consequences, then we can't tie pink to being right. Okay. So that's going to be where 23 is C. And we're going to move on. We got one more example. And remember, these all came from this outline up. I'm in the wrong portion down here. Up here of the sufficient assumption from test June 2007. So section 3. This is another sufficient assumption. If we assume the answer, then it will make the conclusion follow logically. So now, in terms of putting it into action, the conclusion is the early entomologist was wrong. Now, we have talked about this in lesson 1, the structure of a negative reference conclusion, where they're referring to somebody else and saying they are wrong. So what we want to do is find that person. So here's our early entomologist, but we actually want to ignore it because we don't actually care about the person himself. They're not focusing on the source. They're focusing on what the source is saying. Okay. And what they inferred is right here. They inferred that the ants were bringing food to their neighbors. And saying that is wrong means that we have to negate. They're saying this pink is wrong. So when we are negating, what we want to do is break it into the subject matter characteristic and negate the characteristic. So they're saying ants, the subject matter, were bringing food was the characteristic that the entomologist was saying. So saying that they're wrong is saying ants were not bringing food to to their neighbors. So the ants, the yellow, were not bringing food. So now that's the true conclusion through this reference conclusion, where they're referring to somebody else and saying that they're wrong. Quick example that I use from the outline. Most people say that X is the best. However, they are wrong. That's the equivalent of me saying that X is not the best. Notice it has not. If I said Melissa says that X is the best, but she is wrong, I'm still just saying X is not the best. I'm not commenting on Melissa, which is why I'm ignoring the entomologist idea. It has nothing to do with that. So we're saying ants were not bringing food to their neighbors. What is the proof? Now we need to make sure that we have evidence about the ants. We do have evidence about the ants. Okay, but what are we finding out? Do we know about them not bringing food? And the answer is no. There's a language jump here. Okay, as we see with so many sufficient assumptions. What they were doing is emptying their own colony's dumping site. So if you are emptying your own dumping site, then you're not bringing food to neighbors. That's the jump. If that orange, then the pink or not pink from the conclusion. So if you're emptying the dumping site, then we're not bringing food. That's the jump. When pink came out of nowhere, not bringing food, we have no evidence about them actually bringing food or not. We need to have something from the evidence to connect to that. And C will do that. Okay. Ant dumping sites, which is the orange, they do not contain particles that could be used as food. Not food. This is exactly connecting that. Now, if we're looking at the wrong answers, ant societies that do not interact, and remember, sorry, before I go to the answers, since not bringing food is the conclusion that had no evidence for it, our answer has to have something to do with that. If it doesn't, then it will automatically fall short of proving this argument correct. This does not talk about food. It's out. This doesn't influence whether there's food or not. It's out. This is not talking about food, especially to their neighbors. This is saying that they wouldn't carry, because it does talk about particles, so maybe it could have been talking about the particles we were talking about, but the ants to whom the particles were brought, so this is about the neighbors, never brought it back, or never brought it inside, rather, never like brought it home. When I say brought it back, brought it home. They never took it home with them. But that wouldn't talk about whether it was food or not, and so that's why it's out. So this would strengthen the argument E, saying that he retracted his conclusion. Okay, so this would support it. It would strengthen it. If the entomologist is like, wait a minute, I found out orange, so I'm going to change my mind, that would weaken the entomologist's position, strengthening the idea that the author is saying that the guy was wrong. But it doesn't prove it. Remember, sufficient assumption needs to prove the argument correct. And so that's why E would not be correct. Okay, so that's going to be sufficient assumptions. Stay tuned for more to come.